Right now, as you listen to this, there are people on Earth preparing to leave it forever. Not in the way poets describe when they talk about the end of a life, but in a very real, very physical sense. They are training their bodies. They are studying the red soil of a world that sits, on average, about 140 million miles from everything they have ever known. They are learning how to say goodbye to blue skies, to rainstorms, to the feeling of wind on their face. Because anyone who goes to Mars, whether they admit it today or not, will almost certainly never come back. That is not a dramatic statement designed to frighten you. It is simply the truth as science understands it right now. And the reasons go far deeper than most people realize. This is not just a story about distance, though the distance is staggering. It is not just a story about fuel, though the fuel requirements are enormous. It is a story about what happens to the human body when it leaves the only world it was ever designed to live on. It is a story about bones that dissolve, muscles that wither, hearts that forget how to pump against gravity, and minds that slowly unravel in the endless silence between worlds. It is a story about a planet that looks beautiful in photographs, but would kill you in seconds if you stepped outside without protection. And most of all, it is a story about the quiet, irreversible changes that begin the moment a spacecraft leaves Earth orbit and never truly stop. If these peaceful yet profound explorations of our universe help you unwind or spark your curiosity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Cosmic Drift. It helps our community of space travelers grow. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us talk about the journey itself, because before we can understand why Mars is a one-way trip, we need to understand what it takes to get there in the first place. The distance between Earth and Mars is not a fixed number. Both planets orbit the Sun, but they do so at different speeds and along slightly different paths. Sometimes Mars is relatively close to us, about 34 million miles away. Other times, it swings to the far side of the Sun, and the gap stretches to more than 250 million miles. On average, the two planets are separated by about 140 million miles of empty, silent, radiation-filled space. Now here is the important part. A spacecraft cannot simply point itself at Mars and fire its engines in a straight line. That is not how orbital mechanics works. Instead, the ship must follow a curved path, a long sweeping arc that matches the motion of both planets around the Sun. This is called a Hohmann transfer orbit, and it is the most fuel-efficient way to travel between the two worlds. But fuel efficiency comes at a cost, and that cost is time. Using this method, the trip to Mars takes roughly 7 to 9 months, depending on the exact positions of the planets when the spacecraft launches. 7 to 9 months. Think about that for a moment. That is longer than most school years. It is longer than many pregnancies. It is nearly 3/4 of a full year, spent inside a spacecraft that is smaller than most studio apartments, hurtling through a void where the temperature outside is close to negative 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And during every single second of that journey, the human body is being quietly, relentlessly changed. But the travel time is only part of the problem. You see, Earth and Mars do not always line up in a way that makes travel possible. Because both planets are constantly moving, there is only a narrow window every 26 months when the geometry is right for a spacecraft to make the trip efficiently. Miss that window, and you have to wait more than 2 years for the next one. This means that once astronauts arrive on Mars, they cannot simply turn around and come home whenever they want. They would have to wait on the surface of Mars for roughly 500 days, nearly a year and a half, before the planets align again for a return trip. So the total mission time for a round trip to Mars is not 7 months. It is not even a year. It is closer to 3 full years. 3 years away from Earth. 3 years of radiation exposure, muscle loss, bone deterioration, psychological strain, and isolation more extreme than any human being has ever experienced. And that is, if everything goes perfectly, if there are no equipment failures, no medical emergencies, no unforeseen complications. The reality is that a Mars mission would be the single most dangerous thing our species has ever attempted. And the science suggests that even if the astronauts survive the journey, they may never be the same again. Let us start with the most invisible threat, the one you cannot see, cannot smell, cannot taste, and cannot feel until it is far too late. Let us talk about radiation. Right now, as you sit or lie wherever you are listening to this, you are being protected by 2 invisible shields that most people never think about. The first is Earth's magnetic field, a vast bubble of magnetism generated by the churning liquid iron core at the center of our planet. This magnetic field, called the magnetosphere, extends tens of thousands of miles into space and acts like a giant deflector, pushing away the majority of harmful particles that stream toward us from the sun and from deep space. The second shield is our atmosphere, that thin blue layer of air that wraps around the Earth like a blanket. Together, these 2 shields block almost all of the dangerous radiation that would otherwise bombard every living thing on the surface of our world. On a typical day, the average person on Earth absorbs a radiation dose of about 6 millisieverts per year. That number includes everything: the natural radiation from rocks and soil, the tiny amount that seeps through the atmosphere from space, even the small dose you get from eating certain foods. 6 millisieverts per year. Your body can handle that without any trouble at all. Your cells have repair mechanisms that fix the tiny bits of damage that radiation causes, and life goes on without a second thought. Now imagine stepping outside that protection. Imagine climbing into a spacecraft and leaving Earth's magnetic field behind. The moment you do, everything changes. On the International Space Station, which orbits just 250 miles above the Earth's surface, astronauts receive about 72 millisieverts over a 6-month mission. That is already more than 10 times what you would absorb in the same period on the ground. But the space station still sits within Earth's magnetosphere. It still has some protection. A spacecraft heading to Mars has none. Data from the European Space Agency's ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter showed that during a 6-month journey through interplanetary space, an astronaut would be exposed to at least 60% of the total radiation dose recommended for their entire career. Just the trip there, not the time on the surface, not the trip back. Just the flight alone would eat up more than half of the radiation budget that space agencies consider safe for an entire lifetime of space work. And that career limit exists because exceeding it raises the risk of cancer, heart disease, and neurological damage to levels that agencies like NASA consider unacceptable. The radiation in deep space comes from 2 main sources. The first is the sun itself. Our star constantly releases a stream of charged particles called the solar wind, and occasionally it erupts in massive explosions called solar flares or coronal mass ejections. These events can send enormous waves of high-energy particles racing through the solar system at nearly the speed of light. On Earth, the magnetosphere deflects most of this. In deep space, there is nothing between you and the full force of a solar storm. The second source is even more dangerous, and it comes not from our sun, but from the galaxy itself. These are called galactic cosmic rays, and they are among the most energetic particles in the known universe. Galactic cosmic rays are the remnants of supernova explosions, the violent deaths of massive stars that occurred millions or even billions of years ago. These particles have been accelerating through space ever since, gaining incredible energy along the way. Some of them travel at more than 99% the speed of light. And when they strike living tissue, they do not just pass through like an X-ray. They tear through cells like tiny cannonballs, smashing apart DNA, destroying cell membranes, and leaving trails of molecular wreckage behind them. The most dangerous type of galactic cosmic ray is something scientists call HZE particles. HZE stands for high charge and energy. These are the nuclei of heavy elements, things like iron and nickel and carbon, stripped of their electrons and traveling at relativistic speeds. When an HZE particle hits a human cell, it does not just damage the DNA in that one cell. It can damage dozens of cells along its path, creating a track of destruction that the body's repair mechanisms struggle to fix. Some of that damage leads to mutations. Some of those mutations, years or decades later, can turn into cancer. And here is the part that makes this problem so difficult to solve. You cannot effectively shield against galactic cosmic rays with conventional materials. Adding more aluminum to a spacecraft's hull actually makes things worse, because when a cosmic ray strikes the aluminum, it can break apart into a shower of secondary particles, some of which are even more damaging than the original ray. Scientists have experimented with water barriers, polyethylene, and even hydrogen-rich materials, all of which perform somewhat better than metal. But none of them provide complete protection, and the weight of effective shielding would make a spacecraft far too heavy to launch with current technology. NASA's own models predict that for a 3-year Mars mission, the central estimate for radiation-induced mortality could exceed 5%, with upper confidence intervals reaching 10% or higher. That means roughly 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 Mars astronauts could develop a fatal cancer or circulatory disease as a direct result of their radiation exposure. And those numbers do not include the risks to the central nervous system, which are even harder to quantify. Studies on laboratory animals have shown that exposure to HZE particles, even at doses below what a Mars astronaut would experience, can cause measurable damage to the brain. Mice exposed to these particles showed reduced cognitive function, impaired memory, increased anxiety, and changes in behavior that persisted long after the exposure ended. Some researchers found that radiation doses as low as 25 centigrade, which is significantly lower than what a Mars traveler would accumulate, caused notable deficits in how animals responded to their environment and processed information. The implications for a Mars crew are sobering. Imagine spending 9 months traveling through deep space, absorbing cosmic rays every minute of every day, and then arriving at your destination with slightly impaired judgment, reduced reaction time, or difficulty remembering procedures. Now imagine that you need those cognitive abilities to land a spacecraft on another planet, operate complex equipment, and make life or death decisions with no real-time help from Earth. The radiation does not just threaten future health, it threatens the mission itself. And once you land on Mars, the radiation does not stop. Mars has no global magnetic field. It lost its magnetosphere billions of years ago when its core cooled and the internal dynamo that generated the field shut down. Without that magnetic shield, the Martian surface is exposed to the full force of galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events. The planet does have a thin atmosphere, but it provides only modest protection. Data from the Curiosity rover's radiation assessment detector, which has been measuring radiation on the Martian surface since 2012, shows that surface radiation levels are roughly half of what you would experience in open space. Better than the transit, yes, but still far higher than anything considered safe for long-term human habitation without significant shielding. So the astronauts would need to live inside heavily shielded habitats, possibly buried under several feet of Martian soil called regolith, or inside structures made from water-filled walls or other hydrogen-rich materials. Every time they stepped outside for a surface walk, they would be accumulating more radiation. Every minute spent in a spacesuit, exploring the landscape or conducting experiments, would add to their lifetime dose. And over the course of a year and a half waiting for the return window to open, that exposure would continue to climb. Let us shift now from the invisible threat of radiation to something that affects the body in ways that are both more immediate and more visible. Let us talk about what happens to human bones and muscles in space. Your skeleton is not the dead static framework that most people imagine. It is a living, dynamic organ system that constantly rebuilds itself based on the forces it experiences. Every time you stand up, walk across a room, or climb a staircase, the impact and compression of your body weight sends signals through your bones that tell them to stay strong. Special cells called osteoblasts lay down new bone material, while other cells called osteoclasts break down old bone and recycle its minerals. On Earth, these two processes are roughly in balance. Your bones maintain their density and strength because gravity is constantly loading them, and your body responds by reinforcing the structures that bear that load. In microgravity, everything changes. Without the constant pull of gravity, weight-bearing bones, the ones in your spine, hips, and legs, suddenly have nothing to push against. The signals that tell osteoblasts to build new bone slow down. The signals that tell osteoclasts to break down bone do not. The result is a slow, steady loss of bone mineral density that begins almost immediately after entering weightlessness. Studies of astronauts on the International Space Station have shown that, on average, bones lose between 1 and 1.5% of their density every single month in microgravity. The first observation of this phenomenon was recorded in the mid-1970s, when Skylab crew members showed a loss of 1 to 2% bone mass per month, compared to their condition before flight. 1 to 1.5% per month does not sound like much. But remember, a Mars mission lasts 3 years. Even if we assume a conservative rate of bone loss and account for the partial gravity of Mars itself, which is about 38% of Earth's gravity, the cumulative effect over 3 years is devastating. An astronaut could lose 20 to 30% of their bone density in the weight-bearing parts of their skeleton. That is the equivalent of developing severe osteoporosis, a condition that normally takes decades to develop in elderly people on Earth. And here is the truly frightening part. When astronauts return to Earth after long-duration space missions, their bones do not fully recover. Some studies have shown that bone density lost in space is never completely restored, even years after returning to full gravity. The astronaut is left with permanently weakened bones, a higher risk of fractures, and a skeleton that looks decades older than it should. Now here is where it gets complicated for a Mars mission. When astronauts arrive on Mars after 7 to 9 months in microgravity, they will need to immediately start doing physically demanding work. They will need to set up habitats, deploy equipment, conduct surface walks in heavy spacesuits, and perform all the tasks necessary to survive on an alien world. but their bones will already be significantly weakened. Their muscles, which we will discuss in a moment, will also have deteriorated. The risk of a fracture during those critical first days on the surface is not small, and if someone breaks a bone on Mars, there is no hospital, there is no orthopedic surgeon, there is no ambulance, there is only a cramped habitat, a limited medical kit and crew, members who have some medical training but are not doctors. The muscle loss in microgravity is just as alarming. Research has shown that astronauts can lose up to 20% of their average skeletal muscle mass in a single month of weightlessness, and up to 30% of their muscle strength in that same period. The muscles most affected are the ones that work hardest against gravity on Earth, the muscles in the legs, the back, and the core. These are precisely the muscles that astronauts would need most when they arrive on Mars and have to function in a gravitational field again. On the International Space Station, astronauts combat muscle and bone loss with a rigorous exercise program. They work out for roughly 2 hours every day using specially designed equipment, including a device called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, which simulates the effect of lifting weights in gravity. This exercise regimen has been remarkably effective at slowing the rate of muscle and bone loss, and some astronauts have returned from 6-month missions with near normal muscle mass and bone density. But there is a critical catch. The exercise equipment on the space station is enormous and heavy. A spacecraft heading to Mars will need to be as light as possible to conserve fuel, and there simply will not be room for the same caliber of equipment. Astronauts on a Mars transit vehicle will likely have smaller, lighter exercise machines that may not be as effective at preserving musculoskeletal health. And even if the exercise is perfect, there is growing evidence that it may not be enough for a 3-year mission. The space station missions that have been studied most carefully are typically 5 to 6 months long. Extrapolating from that data to a mission 3 to 6 times longer introduces enormous uncertainty. No human being has ever spent 3 consecutive years in space. We simply do not know what that level of sustained microgravity exposure would do to the human body, and the indirect evidence suggests it would not be good. Mars itself offers a partial solution. At 38% of Earth's gravity, the Martian surface provides some gravitational loading for bones and muscles, but research suggests this may not be enough. Studies using mathematical models and animal experiments with partial weight bearing indicate that gravity levels below about 40% of Earth's may be insufficient to maintain full musculoskeletal conditioning over the long term. Mars falls right at the edge of that threshold, and the researchers who study this question have expressed serious concern that Martian gravity alone may not prevent continued bone and muscle deterioration during a long surface stay. There is another dimension to the bone loss problem that most people never consider. When bones break down in microgravity, the calcium and other minerals they release do not simply disappear. They enter the bloodstream and eventually the urinary system. This excess calcium dramatically increases the risk of kidney stones, a condition that is already painful and dangerous on the Earth, but could be catastrophic in space. A kidney stone attack during a Mars transit, hundreds of millions of miles from the nearest hospital, could incapacitate a crew member with agonizing pain, potentially requiring surgical intervention that would be extremely difficult to perform in microgravity. And beyond kidney stones, the elevated calcium levels can cause other problems, including the calcification of soft tissues and disruption of normal cellular function. Let us continue our journey through the human body and talk about what microgravity does to the heart and the circulatory system. On Earth, your cardiovascular system has evolved to work against gravity. When you are standing upright, your heart has to pump blood upward against gravitational pull to reach your brain, and the veins in your legs have special valves that prevent blood from pooling in your lower extremities. These systems work so automatically that you never think about them. But they are the product of millions of years of evolution in a one-gravity environment, and they do not adapt well to the absence of gravity. Within hours of entering microgravity, the body undergoes a dramatic redistribution of fluids. Blood and other liquids that normally settle in the lower half of the body under gravity's influence suddenly rush upward toward the head and chest. Astronauts describe this sensation vividly. Their faces become puffy and swollen. Their sinuses feel congested, as if they have a permanent cold. Their legs become thinner and less engorged with blood. This is sometimes called bird leg syndrome in spaceflight medicine, because of the way astronauts' lower limbs appear to shrink while their upper bodies expand. This fluid shift is not just cosmetic. The increased pressure in the upper body can have serious consequences, particularly for the eyes. A condition known as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome has been identified in a significant percentage of astronauts who spend extended time in microgravity. The syndrome involves changes to the structure of the eye, including flattening of the eyeball, swelling of the optic nerve, and changes to the retina. Many astronauts have reported blurred vision during and after their missions, and some have required corrective lenses in space. A NASA survey found that about 23% of astronauts on short flights and 49% on long flights experience vision problems. For some, these changes persisted for years after returning to Earth. The heart itself also changes in microgravity. Without the need to pump blood against gravity, the heart's workload decreases. Over time, this reduced workload can lead to a decrease in the size and strength of the heart muscle, a process called cardiac deconditioning. The heart essentially becomes lazier because it does not have to work as hard. Blood vessels lose their tone and elasticity. The body's ability to regulate blood pressure becomes impaired. When astronauts return to gravity, whether it is Earth's full gravity or Mars' partial gravity, their deconditioned hearts struggle to maintain adequate blood pressure. This leads to a condition called orthostatic intolerance, which causes dizziness, lightheadedness, and even fainting when standing up. Studies have found that pre-syncopal symptoms, meaning dizziness and nausea, occur in 28 to 65% of astronauts performing stand tests after returning to Earth. On Mars, where gravity is weaker but still present, this could pose a serious operational risk. An astronaut who feels faint every time they stand up is not going to be very effective at setting up a habitat or conducting surface operations. And if an emergency required rapid physical action, a fainting spell could be fatal. The cardiovascular changes extend beyond just the heart and blood pressure. Research has shown that spaceflight, combined with radiation exposure, can damage the endothelial cells that line blood vessels. These cells play a crucial role in maintaining vascular health, and their damage could accelerate the development of cardiovascular disease. Studies on mice exposed to the type of radiation found in deep space showed that cardiac dysfunction appeared within just 1 month of exposure. The animals developed both systolic and diastolic dysfunction, meaning their hearts were less effective at both pumping blood out and filling with blood between beats. For a 3-year Mars mission, the combined effects of microgravity and radiation on the cardiovascular system represent a double threat. The heart weakens from disuse while simultaneously being damaged by cosmic rays. Blood vessels lose their elasticity while their cellular lining is being degraded by radiation. It is a perfect storm of cardiovascular deterioration, and we have no proven countermeasure that can fully prevent it. The immune system is another casualty of spaceflight. On Earth, your immune system is a finely tuned defense network that protects you from bacteria, viruses, fungi, and abnormal cells that could become cancerous. But in space, this system begins to malfunction in ways that scientists are still working to understand. Research has shown that microgravity suppresses the function of T cells, the immune system's primary weapon against infections and cancer. T cells become less able to reproduce properly, and those that do reproduce are less effective at fighting off threats. At the same time, the closed, confined environment of a spacecraft creates ideal conditions for microorganisms to thrive. Bacteria that normally live harmlessly on the human body transfer more easily between crew members in a sealed habitat. Some bacteria have even been shown to become more virulent in microgravity, meaning they are better at causing disease when grown in weightless conditions. Meanwhile, stress hormones like cortisol are elevated in astronauts, further suppressing immune function. The combination of a weakened immune system and an environment where pathogens are more active and more easily transmitted is deeply concerning. Viruses that normally lie dormant in the body, kept in check by a healthy immune system, can reactivate in space. Astronauts on the space station have experienced reactivation of herpes simplex, varicella zoster, the virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, and Epstein-Barr virus during their missions. On a Mars mission, where the crew would be isolated for 3 years with no possibility of medical evacuation and limited pharmaceutical supplies, an infectious disease outbreak could be mission-ending. There would be no way to get new medications or medical equipment from Earth. Whatever the crew brings with them is all they will have for the entire duration of the mission, and their body's natural defenses would be compromised by the very environment they are living in. Let us talk now about something that cannot be measured with a blood test or a bone scan. Let us talk about the mind, because the psychological challenges of a Mars mission may ultimately prove to be the most dangerous of all. Human beings are social creatures. We evolved in communities. We rely on connection, on variety, on the stimulation of changing environments and new experiences. We need sunlight and fresh air and open spaces. We need the comfort of knowing that if something goes wrong, help is nearby. A Mars mission strips all of these things away and replaces them with their opposites. Consider the confinement. A Mars transit vehicle would have a habitable volume roughly comparable to a small house, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 cubic feet of living space. But unlike a house, you cannot step outside for a walk. You cannot open a window. You cannot go to a different room or visit a friend or drive to the store. You are trapped in the same small space with the same small group of people for month after month after month. Every meal is the same rehydrated or preserved food. Every view from the window is the same black void dotted with stars. Every conversation is with someone you have already spoken to thousands of times before. The monotony alone is enough to cause psychological distress, but it is compounded by the danger of the environment. The crew would be constantly aware that they are living in a fragile shell surrounded by the killing vacuum of space. A single hull breach, a single equipment malfunction, a single fire could end everything. This awareness creates a persistent low-level anxiety that never fully goes away, even in the most psychologically resilient individuals. Then there is the isolation. Not just isolation from other people, although that is a factor, but isolation from Earth itself. This is where a concept known as the Earth out of view phenomenon becomes critically important. Astronauts on the International Space Station have consistently reported that one of the most powerful and positive aspects of their experience is the ability to look out the window and see Earth. The view of our home planet, a brilliant blue and white sphere hanging in the blackness of space, provides an emotional anchor. It reminds them of everything they love, everything they are working to return to, everything that makes their sacrifice meaningful. Astronauts have described this experience as profoundly moving, even transformative. It is part of what some have called the overview effect, a shift in perspective that comes from seeing Earth from space. On a Mars mission, this anchor disappears. As the spacecraft moves farther and farther from Earth, our planet shrinks in the window. First, it becomes a small disk, then a bright point of light. Then eventually, it becomes indistinguishable from the other stars in the sky. The crew members would know, intellectually, which point of light is Earth, but the emotional impact of seeing their home reduced to a faint dot, no different from a distant star, is something no human being has ever experienced. Psychologists who study spaceflight have expressed serious concern about the effects of this phenomenon. From the surface of Mars, Earth would appear as a relatively bright star in the sky, but nothing more. There would be no continents to recognize, no oceans to gaze at, no familiar geography to connect with. For the first time in human history, people would be living in a place where they cannot see their home. The psychological impact of that disconnect is impossible to predict with certainty, but analog studies, simulations on Earth that attempt to recreate aspects of Mars mission conditions, have provided some troubling clues. The Mars 500 study, conducted by the Russian Academy of Sciences from 2010 to 2011, locked 6 men in a sealed facility for 520 days to simulate the conditions of a Mars mission. The researchers observed significant differences in how the crew members responded to the prolonged confinement and isolation. Some adapted reasonably well. Others did not. 2 of the 6 crew members who showed the highest stress levels were involved in 85% of all interpersonal conflicts within the group. Sleep patterns became disrupted. Physical activity decreased. Some crew members became increasingly sedentary and withdrawn as the mission progressed. And this was a simulation on Earth, where the participants knew they could leave if there was a true emergency, where they were not actually facing the life-threatening dangers of space, where they were not absorbing cosmic radiation, and where Earth was right outside the facility walls. A real Mars mission would amplify every one of these psychological stressors to levels that are genuinely unprecedented. Communication delays add another layer of psychological stress. Because radio signals travel at the speed of light, and because Mars can be as far as 250 million miles from Earth, messages between the 2 planets can take anywhere from 3 to 22 minutes to travel one way. That means a round-trip conversation would have a delay of up to 44 minutes. You cannot have a real-time phone call with your family. You cannot video chat with your children and hear their responses in real time. You cannot call mission control and get immediate help during an emergency. Every communication becomes a monologue, sent into the void, with a response that arrives many long minutes later. For context, communication delays on the International Space Station are negligible. Astronauts can pick up a phone and talk to their families in something close to real time. They can have weekly video calls with psychologists. They can receive guidance from mission control within seconds during a crisis. All of these support systems which have been crucial for maintaining astronaut mental health on station missions, would be severely degraded or entirely eliminated on a Mars mission. NASA researchers have identified several specific psychological risks that could emerge during a Mars mission. These include depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, cognitive decline, fatigue, and what psychologists call psychological closing, a gradual withdrawal from communication with both crewmates and ground support. Studies of crews in isolated and confined environments, including Antarctic research stations and submarine deployments, have documented all of these phenomena. But none of those environments truly replicate the combination of isolation, danger, confinement, communication delay, and the knowledge that Earth is hundreds of millions of miles away. There is also the question of what happens to crew dynamics over such a long period. Personality conflicts that might be minor annoyances over a 6-month space station mission could become mission-threatening tensions over 3 years. The social psychology literature is full of examples of small groups falling apart under the pressure of prolonged confinement. Cliques form, scapegoats emerge, communication breaks down. In some cases, hostility between crew members has been directed outward toward mission control, a phenomenon that has been observed on both real space missions and in analog environments. The third quarter effect is another concern. Research in isolated environments has suggested that psychological distress often peaks about 3/4 of the way through a mission, regardless of the mission's total duration. At the halfway point, crew members realize that an equally long period of isolation still awaits them, and motivation and morale can plummet. On a 3-year Mars mission, this low point would occur roughly at the 2-year mark, likely during the long surface stay on Mars, when the crew is waiting for the planetary alignment that will allow them to attempt the journey home, if they are even going home at all. Let us pause here and ask a question that sits at the center of this entire topic. Even if astronauts could survive the journey to Mars and the stay on the surface, could they survive the trip back? Because this is where the one-way nature of a Mars mission becomes most painfully clear. After spending roughly 7 to 9 months traveling to Mars in microgravity, and then spending roughly 18 months on the Martian surface in 38% gravity, the astronauts' bodies would be profoundly different from the ones that left Earth. Their bones would be significantly less dense. Their muscles would be weaker, despite whatever exercise they managed to do. Their hearts would be deconditioned. Their blood vessels would be less resilient. Their immune systems would be compromised. Their DNA would have accumulated damage from nearly 2 years of cosmic ray exposure. And then they would need to climb back into a spacecraft and spend another 7 to 9 months in microgravity for the return trip. Those additional months of weightlessness would continue the deterioration that had already been progressing for over 2 years. By the time the crew arrived back in Earth orbit, they would have spent roughly 14 to 18 months in total microgravity, plus another 18 months in the partial gravity of Mars. Their bodies would have been operating in reduced gravity for the better part of 3 years. Now imagine the return to Earth. Landing in a capsule after months of weightlessness is one of the most physically stressful events an astronaut can experience. The deceleration forces during re-entry can reach several times the force of gravity, and the impact of landing, even with parachutes and landing systems, is sudden and jarring. An astronaut with weakened bones, atrophied muscles, a deconditioned heart, and compromised blood pressure regulation would be at severe risk during this phase. The possibility of a fracture, a cardiovascular event, or a syncope episode which means a loss of consciousness from inadequate blood flow to the brain during re-entry and landing, is disturbingly real. And even if the astronauts survive the landing, their challenges are not over. On Earth, returning astronauts need assistance walking. They sometimes cannot stand without support. They require weeks to months of rehabilitation before they can function normally in Earth's gravity. After a 3-year Mars mission, that rehabilitation period would likely be much longer and much more uncertain. Some of the damage, particularly to bones and the cardiovascular system, might never fully reverse. This is why many scientists and space medicine experts believe that a Mars mission, as currently conceived, is essentially a one-way trip, not necessarily because the astronauts cannot physically return to Earth, but because the cumulative damage to their bodies over 3 years of spaceflight would be so severe that returning to Earth's full gravity could itself be dangerous, and the long-term health consequences would likely be profound and irreversible. But the body is only part of the story. Let us turn now to the planet itself, because Mars is not the welcoming new home that some popular media suggests. It is, in almost every measurable way, hostile to human life. Start with the atmosphere. Mars has an atmosphere, but it is nothing like Earth's. It is composed of roughly 95% carbon dioxide, with tiny amounts of nitrogen, argon, and trace gases. There is almost no oxygen. The atmospheric pressure on the surface of Mars is less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure. To put that in perspective, the air pressure on Mars is equivalent to what you would experience at an altitude of about 100,000 feet above Earth's surface, well above the ceiling where the atmosphere becomes too thin to support human life, even with supplemental oxygen. If you stepped outside on Mars without a pressurized suit, the near vacuum would cause the moisture in your lungs and on your skin to boil almost instantly. You would lose consciousness within about 15 seconds and be dead within a minute or two. The temperature is equally inhospitable. Mars is farther from the Sun than Earth, and with its thin atmosphere, it has very little ability to retain heat. The average surface temperature on Mars is about -80 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly -60 degrees Celsius. At the poles, temperatures can plummet to -200 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Even at the equator during the warmest part of a summer day, temperatures might briefly climb above freezing, but they drop rapidly after sunset. There is no warm season on Mars, no tropical beaches, no temperate forests. It is a frozen desert, colder than any place on Earth where humans regularly live. Then there is the dust. Martian dust is not like the dust you find on Earth. It is incredibly fine, much finer than beach sand, with particles as small as a few micrometers across. This dust gets everywhere. It coats everything, and it is dangerous in ways that were not fully appreciated until relatively recently. First, the physical properties of the dust make it a respiratory hazard. The particles are small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs, potentially causing irritation, inflammation, and over time conditions similar to silicosis, a lung disease that affects miners and quarry workers on Earth who breathe in fine rock, dust. During the Apollo missions to the Moon, astronauts reported significant irritation from lunar dust that got inside their habitats and suits. Martian dust would pose similar risks, and because Mars missions would last years rather than days, the cumulative exposure would be much greater. But the most alarming aspect of Martian dust is its chemistry. When NASA's Phoenix lander arrived on Mars in 2008 and conducted soil chemistry experiments, it discovered something that changed our understanding of the Martian surface. The soil contained high concentrations of perchlorate compounds, chemical salts made of chlorine and oxygen. Subsequent missions, including the Curiosity rover, confirmed that perchlorates are present across the Martian surface at concentrations of roughly 0.5% to 1% of the soil by weight. Perchlorates are toxic to humans. They interfere with the thyroid gland, blocking the body's ability to absorb iodine, which is essential for producing hormones that regulate metabolism, growth, and development. On Earth, perchlorates are a known industrial pollutant, and exposure to even small amounts is regulated by health agencies. The safe exposure limit is extremely low, about 7/10,000ths of a milligram per kilogram of body weight per day. Even a few milligrams of Martian dust inhaled or ingested could exceed this threshold. For astronauts living on Mars, perchlorate contamination would be a constant concern. Dust would inevitably be tracked into habitats on spacesuits, equipment, and boots. Despite filtration systems and decontamination protocols, complete elimination of dust from the living environment would be virtually impossible. Over months and years, chronic low-level exposure to perchlorates could cause aplastic anemia, thyroid dysfunction, and other health problems that would be difficult to treat with limited medical resources. And perchlorates are not the only toxic component of Martian dust. The soil also contains silica, nanophase iron oxides, gypsum, and potentially harmful trace metals including chromium, beryllium, arsenic, and cadmium. Some of these substances are known carcinogens. The combination of fine particle size, which allows deep lung penetration, and toxic chemistry makes Martian dust one of the most significant health hazards for any future human presence on the planet. Mars also experiences massive dust storms that can envelop the entire planet. These global dust storms can last for weeks, blocking sunlight and coating everything in a thick layer of fine particles. For a human settlement that relies on solar power, a global dust storm could be catastrophic, cutting off energy production for weeks at a time. For the inhabitants themselves, the increased dust levels in the environment would exacerbate all of the health risks already described. Now, let us consider the practical realities of living on Mars, because even setting aside the health risks, the logistical challenges of sustaining human life on the planet are staggering. Everything that humans need to survive, air, water, food, shelter, energy, and medical supplies, would either need to be brought from Earth or manufactured on Mars from local resources. And bringing things from Earth is extraordinarily expensive and slow. With current rocket technology, the cost of transporting 1 kilogram of payload from Earth to the Martian surface runs into thousands of dollars. A single kilogram. A Mars settlement would need to transport millions of kilograms of equipment, supplies, and materials. And because of the 26-month launch window constraint, resupply missions could only be sent every 2 years at best. This means that any Mars settlement would need to be largely self-sufficient from the very beginning. The settlers would need to produce their own breathable air, probably by extracting carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere and splitting it into carbon and oxygen. They would need to find and purify water, probably by mining subsurface ice deposits that exist in certain regions of the planet. They would need to grow their own food, likely in pressurized greenhouses using artificial lighting, because the Martian soil in its natural state is toxic, and the weak sunlight provides less energy for photosynthesis than Earth's surface receives. Each of these challenges is technically solvable in principle, but each involves enormous engineering complexity and countless potential failure points. A leak in a habitat module could vent precious breathable air into the thin Martian atmosphere. A failure in the water purification system could leave the settlement without drinking water. A disease in the greenhouse crops could wipe out a food supply with no possibility of getting replacement seeds from Earth for more than 2 years. Every system would need multiple redundancies, and even then, the risk of a single point of failure cascading into a survival crisis would be ever present. And then there is the question of medical care. On Earth, we take for granted the vast infrastructure of modern medicine, the hospitals, specialists, pharmacies, ambulances, and medical supply chains that keep us alive when things go wrong. On Mars, none of that would exist. The crew would have whatever medical equipment and pharmaceuticals they brought with them, and whatever training they had received before departure. For minor injuries and common illnesses, this might be adequate. But for serious medical emergencies, a heart attack, a stroke, a ruptured appendix, severe trauma from a fall, the options would be extremely limited. There is no possibility of medical evacuation from Mars. If someone becomes critically ill or seriously injured, they cannot be transported back to Earth. Even if a return vehicle were available, the 7 to 9 month transit time makes emergency evacuation meaningless for any acute medical condition. The patient would either recover with whatever treatment the crew could provide, or they would not. This reality alone makes a Mars mission fundamentally different from any previous human space endeavor. On the International Space Station, a crew member who develops a serious medical problem can be back on Earth within hours via a Soyuz capsule. On Mars, there is no such safety net. Let us return now to the journey itself and explore a dimension of the experience that is rarely discussed but deeply significant. Let us talk about what it means to leave Earth knowing that you may never feel rain on your face again. This might seem like a small thing in the context of radiation doses and bone density loss and perchlorate toxicity. But human beings are not clinical data points. We are creatures of experience, of sensation, of memory. We are shaped by the environments we inhabit, and we carry the landscapes of our lives within us as surely as we carry our DNA. Think about the things you experience every day without thinking about them. The feeling of sunlight warming your skin, the sound of birds in the morning, the smell of coffee brewing, the taste of fresh fruit, the sensation of wind moving through your hair, the rustle of leaves, the crack of thunder, the splash of jumping into cool water on a hot day, the crunch of snow under your feet, the sight of clouds drifting across a blue sky. None of these things exist on Mars. Not one. Mars has no birds, no trees, no oceans, no rain, no fresh air, no blue sky. Its sky is a hazy butterscotch color during the day, fading to a deep blue only at the edges of sunrise and sunset. The landscape is a barren expanse of rust-colored rock and dust, stretching to a horizon that is closer than the Earth's, because Mars is a smaller planet. There are no seasons in the way we understand them. No spring flowers or autumn leaves. There is no weather that a human would recognize. Only dust storms and temperature extremes. For the first Mars settlers, this absence of sensory familiarity would be one of the greatest challenges they face. Humans have deep, often unconscious connections to the natural world. Studies have shown that exposure to nature reduces stress, improves mood, enhances cognitive function, and supports overall mental health. Depriving a person of all natural sensory input for years at a time is a form of sensory deprivation that has never been tested on this scale. Some researchers have suggested that virtual reality could help bridge the gap. allowing Mars settlers to experience simulated Earth environments as a form of psychological therapy. Others have proposed that growing plants inside the habitat, a form of greenhousing, could provide some of the psychological benefits of contact with living things. These ideas have merit, but they are also acknowledgements of a fundamental truth. Mars is not home. It will never feel like home in the way that Earth does. And for the people who go there, that loss of home, that permanent exile from everything familiar, would be a wound that no technology can fully heal. There is a moment in every discussion of Mars exploration when the conversation shifts from the practical to the philosophical. From the question of can we go to the question of should we go, and from the question of what will happen to their bodies to the question of what will happen to their souls. Because here is the thing that makes a Mars mission different from every other dangerous expedition in human history. Once you commit to the journey, once the rockets fire and the spacecraft leaves Earth orbit, you are on a path that leads to a world from which return is, at best, uncertain, and at worst, impossible. This is a one-way door, or something very close to it, and yet, there are people who want to go. When the Mars One project, a now defunct private initiative that proposed to send settlers to Mars with no return trip, opened applications, more than 200,000 people from around the world applied. They knew the risks. They knew they would never come back, and they applied anyway. What drives a person to make that choice? Part of it is the human desire for exploration, the same impulse that sent our ancestors out of Africa and across the oceans. Part of it is the belief that establishing human life on another planet is the single most important thing our species can do, a form of cosmic insurance against extinction. And part of it is the understanding that every great advance in human history has required someone to go first, to accept the sacrifice, so that those who follow can benefit. Now, let us dive deeper into some of the specific scientific realities that make Mars so challenging for the human body, because there are aspects of this topic that we have only touched on so far, and they deserve a closer examination. Let us begin with the NASA Twin Study, one of the most important investigations into the effects of long-duration spaceflight ever conducted. The study compared identical twin astronauts Scott and Mark Kelly. Scott spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station, while Mark remained on Earth. Because the brothers are genetically identical, any differences that emerged during and after the mission could be attributed to the effects of spaceflight rather than genetic variation. The results, published in the journal Science, were both reassuring and deeply concerning. On the reassuring side, many of the changes Scott experienced during his time in space, including shifts in immune response, changes in gut bacteria, and alterations in body weight, returned to normal within 6 months of his return to Earth. This suggested that the human body is remarkably resilient and can recover from extended periods in microgravity. But the concerning findings were significant. About 7% of Scott's gene expression changes did not return to pre-flight levels, even months after his return. These persistent changes included genes related to DNA repair, immune system, function, bone formation, and the body's response to low oxygen conditions. His telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that are associated with aging and cellular health, initially lengthened during spaceflight, possibly due to increased stem cell activity, but then shortened rapidly after his return. This accelerated telomere shortening could have implications for long-term health, including increased cancer risk. Scott also experienced thickening of his carotid artery, changes to his retina, and reductions in certain cognitive functions after returning to Earth. And remember, this was after 340 days in low Earth orbit, within the protective shield of Earth's magnetosphere. A Mars mission would last 3 times as long and would expose astronauts to radiation levels roughly 8 times higher than what Scott experienced. The twin study, groundbreaking as it was, may have only scratched the surface of the changes that a Mars mission would produce. The study's principal investigator described the findings as providing a biomedical and molecular roadmap for future astronauts. But it also raised more questions than it answered. If 340 days in low Earth orbit can cause persistent changes in gene expression, what would 3 years in deep space do? If 7% of gene expression changes are still altered after a year on the space station, what percentage would remain altered after a Mars mission? These are questions that cannot be answered without sending someone to Mars and studying what happens to them. But therein lies the dilemma. The only way to fully understand the risks is to accept them. Let us go deeper into the radiation problem, because we have not yet discussed one of its most insidious aspects: what cosmic rays do to the brain. The human brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through an intricate web of synapses. These connections are what allow you to think, to remember, to feel, to make decisions, to understand language, to recognize faces, to experience consciousness itself, and they are exquisitely vulnerable to radiation. When a high-energy cosmic ray particle passes through the brain, it leaves a trail of ionization damage along its path. Neurons in the path of the particle can be killed or damaged. The synaptic connections between neurons can be disrupted. The delicate chemical signaling that underlies thought and memory can be thrown off balance. In most cases, a single cosmic ray strike on a single neuron would have no noticeable effect. There are too many neurons for the loss of one to matter. But over the course of a 3-year Mars mission, the cumulative effect of thousands of such strikes could be meaningful. Animal studies have provided troubling evidence. Mice and rats exposed to HZE particles similar to those found in galactic cosmic rays showed reduced performance on tests of learning and memory. They displayed increased anxiety and depression-like behavior. Some showed changes in the structure of their dendritic spines, the tiny projections on neurons where synaptic connections are made. These changes were observed at radiation doses comparable to, or even lower than, what a Mars astronaut would experience. One particularly concerning finding was that radiation-exposed animals showed deficits in what researchers call executive function, the ability to plan, to prioritize, to make complex decisions, and to adapt behavior based on changing circumstances. These are precisely the cognitive skills that would be most critical for astronauts managing a Mars mission, where problems would need to be solved independently. Resources would need to be carefully managed, and every decision could have life or death consequences. Researchers have been careful to note that results from animal studies cannot be directly translated to human risk predictions. The human brain may be more or less vulnerable than a mouse brain to the effects of cosmic radiation. But the fact that measurable cognitive effects appear at doses within the range that Mars astronauts would experience is, at minimum, a serious red flag. And there is another dimension to this problem that is even more troubling. Some of the radiation effects on the brain may not appear immediately. They may develop over months or years, gradually eroding cognitive function in ways that are difficult to detect until they cross a threshold where performance noticeably declines. An astronaut who seems perfectly healthy and cognitively sharp during the first year of a Mars mission might begin to show subtle deficits during the second year, with those deficits becoming more pronounced during the third. By then, they would be hundreds of millions of miles from any possibility of medical intervention. Let us shift now to another aspect of the Mars experience that is rarely discussed in popular accounts of future missions: the problem of gravity transition. A Mars crew would experience not one, but at least 4 distinct gravitational environments during their mission. First, Earth's normal gravity of 1g during pre-launch and launch. Second, microgravity during the 7 to 9 month transit to Mars. Third, Mars gravity of 0.38 g during the surface stay. And fourth, microgravity again during the 7 to 9 month return trip to Earth. Each transition would require the body to readjust its physiological systems, and each readjustment would come with risks. The most dangerous transition would be from microgravity to Mars gravity upon arrival. After 7 to 9 months of weightlessness, the astronauts' cardiovascular systems would be deconditioned, their bones weakened, their muscles atrophied, and their sense of balance and spatial orientation disrupted. Landing on Mars and immediately dealing with even 38% gravity would be physically challenging and potentially dangerous. Studies of astronauts returning to Earth after 6-month space station missions have shown significant impairment in balance, coordination, and physical performance that can last for days or weeks. Mars's lower gravity would be less demanding than Earth's, but the astronauts' bodies would also be more compromised after a longer transit. There is a concept in spaceflight medicine called operational performance, which refers to an astronaut's ability to function effectively upon arrival at a destination. NASA is deeply concerned about ensuring that Mars crew members can perform essential tasks immediately after landing, because the first hours and days on the surface would be critical for setting up life support systems, deploying equipment, and establishing a safe living environment. If the crew arrives too physically impaired to work effectively, the entire mission could be in jeopardy. The return trip poses an even greater challenge. After spending a year and a half on Mars, where gravity is only about a third of Earth's, the body would have partially adapted to the lower gravitational load. Some research suggests that prolonged exposure to Mars gravity would still result in continued bone and muscle loss, though at a slower rate than in full microgravity. Then the crew would face another 7 to 9 months of zero gravity during the transit home. By the time they reached Earth orbit, their bodies would have spent roughly 3 years in reduced gravity conditions, and the transition back to full Earth gravity would be the most physically demanding thing they had ever experienced. There is a very real possibility that after a 3-year Mars mission, some astronauts might not be able to walk unassisted upon return to Earth. Their bones might be too fragile. Their muscles might be too weak. Their cardiovascular systems might not be able to maintain adequate blood pressure in an upright position. They might need months of rehabilitation before they could resume anything close to a normal physical life. And some of the damage, particularly to their bones and their DNA, might be permanent. This is what makes many scientists uncomfortable when they hear proposals for Mars colonization that treat the journey as something routine or casual. It is not routine. It is not casual. It is, based on everything we currently know, one of the most physically damaging experiences a human body can endure, and the recovery from that experience is uncertain at best and incomplete at worst. let us talk about the Martian environment itself in more detail, because there are aspects of life on Mars that go beyond the immediate threats to physical health and touch on something more fundamental about what it means to be human. Mars is a dead world. As far as we know, there is no life on Mars today, and if there ever was, it existed billions of years ago when the planet still had liquid water, a thicker atmosphere, and a magnetic field to protect its surface. Today, Mars is a cold, dry, airless desert. The surface is barren rock and dust, shaped by wind, and ancient water flows into a landscape that is beautiful in its starkness, but utterly devoid of the biological richness that characterizes Earth. The absence of life on Mars means something profound for any human who tries to live there. On Earth, we are surrounded by life. It is in the soil beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, in the water we drink, even in the most barren deserts and the deepest oceans. Life is present. Our bodies contain trillions of microorganisms that we depend on for digestion, immune function, and metabolic regulation. The biosphere of Earth is not just our environment. It is part of us. We are, in a very real sense, ecosystems unto ourselves, and those ecosystems evolved in concert with the larger ecosystems of our planet. On Mars, the settlers would be cut off from the biosphere of Earth. They would bring some microorganisms with them, the ones that live in and on their bodies. They might bring some in the soil of their greenhouses, but the vast web of life that sustains Earth's ecosystem would be absent. There would be no pollinating insects, no decomposing fungi, no nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the wild soil. Every biological process necessary for survival would need to be artificially maintained inside the sealed habitats. If those systems failed, there would be no natural backup, no resilient biosphere to fall back on. This kind of extreme dependence on technology for every aspect of survival is something that no human community has ever experienced. Even the most isolated human settlements on Earth, from Arctic research stations to remote island communities, benefit from the background life support provided by Earth's biosphere. They have breathable air, they have water cycles, they have an ozone layer that blocks harmful ultraviolet radiation. They have a magnetosphere that deflects cosmic rays. They have a biosphere that continuously renews the oxygen they breathe and removes the carbon dioxide they exhale. Mars settlers would have none of these things. Their survival would depend entirely on machines, and machines break. Life support systems fail. Seals degrade. Filters clog. Electronics malfunction. Over the years and decades of a permanent Mars settlement, every component of every system would eventually need to be repaired or replaced. And if a critical system failed and could not be repaired, the consequences would be immediate and potentially fatal. This is the fundamental paradox of Mars colonization. The planet is close enough to reach with current or near-future technology, but it is hostile enough to require a level of technological infrastructure and reliability that we have never achieved for any human settlement. The margin for error is essentially zero. On Earth, a power outage is an inconvenience. On Mars, a power outage could be a death sentence. And yet, despite all of these challenges, despite all of the risks, despite the radiation and the bone loss and the psychological toll and the toxic dust and the hostile environment, there are people who are working right now to make human Mars missions a reality. Companies like SpaceX are developing massive rockets designed to carry both crew and cargo to Mars. NASA is pursuing its own path through the Artemis program, using the Moon as a stepping stone, China has announced plans for Mars missions in the 2030s. The founder of SpaceX has been characteristically blunt about the risks, acknowledging that the early days of Mars colonization would be extremely dangerous, and noting that there is a good chance early colonists would face life-threatening situations. NASA officials have described sending humans to Mars even by the 2040s as an audacious goal, reflecting a more cautious assessment of the challenges involved. But here is where we need to be honest about something. All of these plans are based on certain assumptions about the human body's ability to withstand the journey and the destination. And those assumptions have not been fully tested. No human being has ever traveled to Mars. No human being has ever spent 3 years in space. No human being has ever lived for an extended period on a world other than Earth. Every model, every simulation, every animal study, every analog mission, every carefully designed experiment, they all try to predict what will happen when humans finally take that step. But predictions are not certainties. And the only way to truly know what a Mars mission will do to the human body and mind is to send someone there and find out. That is the essence of exploration. It is the willingness to step into the unknown, armed with the best knowledge available, but accepting that the unknown may hold surprises that no amount of preparation can fully anticipate. The first Mars astronauts will be walking into the greatest unknown that any human being has ever faced. They will be farther from home than any person has ever been. They will be exposed to hazards that we can describe in theory, but have never witnessed in practice. And they will be carrying the hopes of their entire species on their shoulders. Whether we call it a one-way trip or a mission of extraordinary risk, the reality remains the same. Going to Mars is not like going anywhere else. It is not like crossing an ocean or climbing a mountain or even going to the moon. It is a commitment of a kind that our species has never made before. A commitment that will change the people who make it in ways that we can begin to predict but cannot fully know. And perhaps that is what makes it so compelling. Perhaps the very impossibility of it, the very danger, the very permanence of the sacrifice is what gives it meaning. Because if going to Mars were easy, if it were safe, if it were just a longer version of a trip to the International Space Station, it would not be the achievement that it is. It would not represent the leap that it represents. The reason going to Mars matters is precisely because it is hard. Because it asks everything of the people who attempt it. Because it demands that they give up the world they know for a world they have only seen in photographs and datasets. Let us spend some more time with the psychological experience of a Mars mission, because there are aspects of this that are both fascinating and deeply poignant. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of the first humans on Mars. You have been in space for nearly 9 months. You have endured the monotony, the confinement, the communication delays, the physical deterioration. And now you step out of your lander onto the surface of another world. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of a quiet room or a still night on Earth, but a deeper silence. The silence of a world where there is no wind that you can hear through your helmet, no birdsong, no distant traffic, no other human voices carried on the air, just the sound of your own breathing inside your suit and the soft crunch of your boots on the regolith. You look up and see a sky that is the color of butterscotch. The sun is smaller here, about 2/3 the size it appears from Earth, and its light feels weaker, more diffused. The landscape stretches to a horizon that seems oddly close, a consequence of Mars's smaller size. Everywhere you look, there is rock and dust and more rock and dust. in shades of rust and ochre and grey. There are no trees, no rivers, no clouds in the familiar sense. Just rock and sky, and the curved horizon of a planet that is not your own. You look for Earth and cannot find it, not because it is not there, but because it is just another point of light in the Martian sky, no more distinctive than any other star. You know which one it is, because your training tells you, but your heart does not recognize it. Your eyes cannot see the blue. Your mind cannot bridge the gap between that tiny speck and the world where your family lives, where your children are growing up without you, where the rain falls and the seasons change, and life goes on in all its messy, beautiful, ordinary glory. This is the moment that psychologists worry about. This is the moment when the reality of what you have done crashes into your consciousness with its full weight. You are further from home than any human being has ever been, and you may never go back. The concept of home is deeply embedded in human psychology. It is not just a place. It is a constellation of memories, relationships, sensory experiences, and emotional attachments that form the bedrock of our sense of self. Home is where we belong. It is where the world makes sense. And for the Mars settlers, home would be 225 million miles away, visible only as a faint point of light in an alien sky. Some people might thrive in this environment. History is full of examples of individuals who found meaning and purpose in extreme circumstances, who drew strength from adversity and built lives of deep fulfillment far from everything they had known. The first Mars settlers might be such people, individuals whose sense of adventure and purpose is strong enough to outweigh the losses they have incurred. But others might struggle. The psychological literature on isolation and confinement suggests that even the most resilient individuals can be broken by enough time in extreme conditions. Depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, and cognitive decline are not signs of weakness. They are predictable human responses to environments that violate our deepest evolved needs for connection, stimulation, and safety. And Mars, for all its grandeur, is an environment that violates every single one of those needs. There is a phenomenon in the psychology of extreme environments known as the long eye, where people in extended isolation develop a distant, unfocused gaze. It has been observed in Antarctic winter over crews and in prisoners in solitary confinement. It is thought to be a symptom of psychological disengagement, a kind of mental withdrawal from an overwhelming or unstimulating environment. The conditions that produce it would all be present in abundance on Mars. Now, let us talk about something that is often overlooked in discussions of Mars missions: the challenge of growing food on another planet. As we mentioned earlier, any Mars settlement would need to produce at least some of its own food, because the cost of transporting food from Earth is prohibitive for anything beyond the earliest missions. This means growing plants in controlled environments on the Martian surface, which presents a unique set of challenges. First, the Martian soil cannot be used directly for agriculture. Beyond the perchlorate contamination we discussed, Mars regolith lacks the organic matter, microbial communities, and nutrient balance that terrestrial soil provides. Growing plants would require either hydroponics, where plants are grown in nutrient-rich water without soil, or aeroponics, where plant roots are suspended in air and periodically misted with nutrients, or the development of an artificial soil created from processed regolith, supplemented with nutrients and microbial cultures. Second, the sunlight on Mars is significantly weaker than on Earth. Mars is about 50% farther from the Sun than Earth. which means it receives only about 43% as much solar energy per unit area. This is enough to grow some plants, but it limits the types of crops that can be cultivated and the yields that can be expected. Supplemental lighting, powered by solar panels or nuclear reactors, would likely be necessary. Third, the Martian day, called a sol, is slightly longer than an Earth day, about 24 hours and 37 minutes. This means that plants accustomed to Earth's light cycle would need to adjust to a slightly different rhythm, which might affect their growth patterns. More importantly, the length of the Martian year, about 687 Earth days, and the planet's axial tilt of about 25 degrees, create seasons that are longer and more extreme than Earth's. Fourth, the low atmospheric pressure on Mars means that any greenhouse would need to be pressurized, creating an enclosed environment that is vulnerable to leaks, equipment failures, and contamination. Maintaining the right balance of carbon dioxide, oxygen, humidity, and temperature inside a Martian greenhouse would require constant monitoring and adjustment, with little room for error. Despite these challenges, researchers have made progress in understanding how plants respond to Mars-like conditions. Experiments on the International Space Station have shown that many common crop plants can grow in microgravity. Earth-based experiments using simulated Mars soil have demonstrated that certain plants can survive in regolith-like substrates, provided the perchlorates are removed and nutrients are added. But growing enough food to sustain a human crew is a much larger challenge than growing a few experimental plants. A settlement of even a handful of people would need a diverse diet that provides all essential nutrients, including proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. This would likely require growing a variety of crops, possibly supplemented by some form of protein production, whether from plants, algae, insects, or cultured cells. The agricultural infrastructure needed to support even a small Mars settlement would be substantial, and any failure in that system could have immediate and serious consequences for the crew's nutrition and health. Let us now consider the long-term implications of human settlement on Mars. Not just the challenges of the first mission or the first few years, but what it would mean for humanity to establish a permanent presence on another planet. If the first Mars settlers survive and establish a functioning settlement, they will face a decision that no human community has ever confronted. Do they try to return to Earth, accepting the risks of the journey and the uncertain recovery? Or do they stay on Mars, building a new life on a new world, accepting that they and their descendants will be Martians, not Earthlings? For the first generation, the choice might be made for them by circumstances. Their bodies might be too degraded by radiation and reduced gravity to survive the return trip and readaptation to Earth. Their bone density might be too low. Their cardiovascular systems might be too compromised. Their immune systems might be too weakened. The cumulative damage of 3 or more years of spaceflight might simply make return impossible, even if a spacecraft were available. But what about the next generation? What about children born on Mars? This is a question that raises profound biological, ethical, and philosophical issues. We have no data on how human reproduction would be affected by the Martian environment. Would conception occur normally in Mars gravity? Would embryonic development proceed without complications in an environment with higher radiation levels and lower gravity than Earth? Would children born on Mars develop normally, or would the reduced gravitational loading affect their bone and muscle development in ways that make them fundamentally different from children born on Earth? Some researchers have speculated that children who grow up on Mars in 38% gravity, might develop taller, more slender bodies with less dense bones than their earthbound counterparts. Their cardiovascular systems might adapt to the lower gravitational load, making it even harder for them to visit Earth than it would be for the original settlers. Over generations, the Martian population might diverge physiologically from the Earthbound population, becoming people who are adapted to Mars but unable to live comfortably on Earth. This is not science fiction. It is a logical extrapolation of what we know about how the human body responds to its environment. We know that bone density, muscle development, and cardiovascular function are all influenced by gravitational loading. We know that these systems develop differently in different gravitational environments. And we know that some of these developmental changes, particularly those that occur during childhood, can be permanent. The first generation of Mars-born humans might be the beginning of a genuine divergence in the human species. Ideen, not a speciation event in the genetic sense, at least not immediately, but a physiological divergence that would make Mars-born people as distinct from Earth-born people as any two populations of humans have ever been. They would be the first true extraterrestrial humans, a new branch on the human family tree, adapted to a world that is not the one where our species evolved. Think about what that means. For the first time in the history of our species, there would be people for whom Earth is not home, not just in the abstract sense that they have never been there, but in the physical sense that their bodies would not function properly in Earth's gravity. The world that we think of as the cradle of civilization would be, for them, an alien world. Let us take a moment to return to something we touched on earlier and explore it more thoroughly, because it deserves more attention. Let us talk about what happens when the human body tries to sleep in space, and why the disruption of sleep patterns could compound every other problem we have discussed. On Earth, your sleep is regulated by a finely tuned internal clock called the circadian rhythm. This clock is synchronized primarily by exposure to natural light. The blue wavelengths of sunlight during the day tell your brain to stay alert, while the dimming light of evening triggers the release of melatonin, the hormone that makes you feel drowsy and prepares your body for rest. This cycle is so fundamental to human health that disrupting it even modestly through shift work, jet lag, or exposure to artificial light at night is associated with a wide range of health problems, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, weakened immune function, and impaired cognitive performance. In space, the circadian rhythm is thrown into confusion. On the International Space Station, which orbits the Earth every 90 minutes, astronauts experience 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every 24 hours. There is no natural light cycle to anchor their internal clocks. The station uses artificial lighting to try to maintain a normal day and night pattern. But studies have shown that astronauts still experience significant disruptions to their sleep. On average, astronauts sleep less than 6 hours per night, well below the 7 to 8 hours recommended for optimal health. On a Mars transit vehicle, the situation would be even more challenging. There would be no sunrises or sunsets at all, just the constant, unchanging darkness of interplanetary space, punctuated by the artificial lighting inside the spacecraft. Without any natural environmental cues to anchor the circadian rhythm, the crew would be entirely dependent on the spacecraft's lighting system to maintain a healthy sleep cycle. And even the best artificial lighting may not fully replicate the complex spectral qualities of natural sunlight that the circadian system has evolved to respond to. Sleep deprivation even in modest amounts, degrades cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and immune function. It impairs decision-making, reduces reaction time, and increases the likelihood of errors. For a Mars crew making life or death decisions in a hostile environment, sleep deprivation is not a minor inconvenience. It is a genuine safety risk. And on Mars itself, the Sol is 24 hours and 37 minutes long, just different enough from Earth's 24-hour day to create a persistent mismatch with the circadian rhythm that could accumulate over months and years. Research with Mars mission analogues has shown that prolonged exposure to the Martian sol length without the anchoring effect of natural sunlight can cause progressive circadian drift. The body's internal clock slowly falls out of sync with the imposed schedule, leading to chronic sleep disruption, daytime drowsiness, and reduced alertness during working hours. Over the course of an 18-month surface stay, this cumulative sleep debt could significantly impair the crew's ability to function effectively, compounding the effects of radiation exposure, reduced gravity, and psychological stress. Now let us consider a dimension of the Mars challenge that involves the very DNA inside your cells, because what happens to our genetic material in deep space is one of the most active and urgent areas of research in spaceflight medicine. Every cell in your body contains approximately 6.5 feet of DNA, tightly coiled and packaged into chromosomes. This DNA is the instruction manual for everything your body does, from building new cells to fighting infections to regulating your heartbeat. And it is constantly under attack, not just from cosmic radiation, but from the normal metabolic processes of life itself. Every day, tens of thousands of DNA lesions occur in every cell as a result of normal cellular activity. Your body has an elaborate repair system that fixes almost all of this damage before it can cause problems. But the key word is almost. In deep space, the rate of DNA damage increases dramatically. Galactic cosmic rays and their secondary particles strike the DNA directly, creating breaks in the TAR, double helix, crosslinks between strands, and chemical modifications to individual bases. Some of these lesions are repaired efficiently. Others are repaired imperfectly, introducing errors, which are mutations, into the genetic code. And some are not repaired at all, leading to cell death, or, in the worst case, to uncontrolled cell growth, which is cancer. The twin study provided a fascinating window into this process. Researchers found that Scott Kelly's time on the space station, which was within the protection of Earth's magnetosphere and far less radiation intense than deep space, still produced measurable increases in DNA damage and changes in the activity of DNA repair genes. His body responded to the increased damage by ramping up repair mechanisms, but the elevated level of DNA disruption was still detectable months after his return. For a Mars mission, where radiation levels would be roughly 8 times higher than on the space station, and the exposure would last 3 times as long, the DNA damage burden would be far greater. The body's repair systems would be working overtime, but there is a limit to how much damage they can keep up with. Beyond that limit, unrepaired or misrepaired DNA begins to accumulate, increasing the risk of cancer and accelerating the aging process. There is also a less well understood, but potentially significant effect of radiation on the epigenome, the system of chemical tags and modifications that sit on top of the DNA and control which genes are turned on or off. Epigenetic changes can alter gene expression without changing the underlying DNA sequence, and they can be influenced by environmental factors including radiation. The twin study found significant epigenetic changes in Scott Kelly during his mission, and while most returned to normal after his return, some persisted. The implications of persistent epigenetic changes from a 3-year deep space mission are unknown, but they could affect everything from immune function to metabolism to cognitive health. Another area of concern is the gut microbiome, the vast community of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that live in the human digestive system. These microorganisms play crucial roles in digestion, immune function, vitamin production, and even mental health through the gut-brain axis. Research has shown that the composition of the gut microbiome changes during spaceflight, with shifts in the relative abundance of different bacterial species. The twin study documented significant changes in Scott Kelly's gut bacteria during his time in space, though most returned to pre-flight levels after his return. On a Mars mission, the crew's microbiomes would be shaped by several unusual factors. They would be eating a limited diet of preserved and possibly grown foods. They would be living in a sealed environment with recycled air and water. They would be sharing a small space with a small number of people, leading to a gradual convergence of their microbial communities. And they would be under chronic stress, which is known to alter the gut microbiome in ways that can affect both physical and mental health. The long-term implications of these microbial changes are difficult to predict. A healthy, diverse gut microbiome is associated with better immune function, better metabolic health, and even better mental health. A disrupted microbiome is associated with a range of problems, from digestive disorders to increased susceptibility, to infections to inflammation. For a crew that needs to maintain optimal health in an environment with limited medical resources, the state of their gut bacteria could be more important than most people realize. Let us now talk about an aspect of Mars that is truly alien, something that makes it fundamentally different from any environment that humans have ever inhabited. Let us talk about the magnetic field, or rather, the absence of one. Earth's magnetic field is generated by the churning of liquid iron and nickel in our planet's outer core, a process called the geodynamo. This field extends thousands of miles into space and creates a protective bubble, the magnetosphere, that shields the surface from the worst of the solar wind and cosmic radiation. Every compass needle that points north, every aurora that dances in the polar sky, every migratory bird that finds its way south for the winter, all of these are manifestations of the invisible magnetic field that permeates and protects our world. Mars lost its global magnetic field billions of years ago. The planet's core, smaller and cooler than Earth's, solidified over time, shutting down the internal dynamo that had once generated a Martian magnetosphere. Without that magnetic shield, the solar wind gradually stripped away most of Mars's atmosphere, turning a once warmer, wetter world into the cold, dry desert we see today. For human settlers, the absence of a magnetic field on Mars means much more than increased radiation exposure, though that alone is significant. Earth's magnetic field interacts with the human body in subtle ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. Some research suggests that biological systems, from migrating birds to swimming bacteria, use the Earth's magnetic field for orientation and navigation. Whether the human body relies on geomagnetic cues in any important way is not yet clear, but the possibility cannot be ruled out. What is clear is that without a magnetic field, Mars offers no natural protection against solar storms. On Earth, when the Sun unleashes a massive coronal mass ejection, the magnetosphere absorbs and deflects most of the energetic particles. The most visible result is a brightening of the auroras at the poles. but the biological impact on the surface is minimal. On Mars, a major solar storm would send a wave of high-energy particles directly into the thin atmosphere and down to the surface. Anyone caught outside without adequate shielding during such an event could receive a dangerous or even lethal radiation dose in a matter of hours. Solar storms are unpredictable. They can occur with little warning. And while space weather forecasting has improved significantly, it is not yet reliable enough to give Mars settlers days of advance notice. From Earth, monitoring the Sun and predicting storms is relatively straightforward because we have a network of solar observatories. From Mars, monitoring would be more difficult because the planet is farther from the Sun and because communication delays would slow the transmission of warnings from Earth-based observatories. This means that any Mars settlement would need a robust emergency shelter system, a heavily shielded safe room where the crew could retreat during a solar storm. The shelter would need to be accessible quickly, within minutes of a storm warning, and it would need to provide enough shielding to reduce the radiation dose to safe levels for the duration of the event, which could last from hours to days. Designing, building, and maintaining such a shelter on Mars, using local materials and limited equipment, would be a significant engineering challenge. Let us also consider the question of water, because water is the most fundamental resource for human survival, and its availability on Mars is both promising and complicated. Mars has water, quite a lot of it in fact, but almost all of it is frozen. The polar ice caps contain vast quantities of water ice mixed with frozen carbon dioxide. Subsurface ice deposits have been detected at various locations across the planet, particularly in the mid to high latitudes. And there is evidence of ancient river channels, lake beds, and possibly ocean shorelines that tell us Mars once had liquid water on its surface billions of years ago. For a Mars settlement, accessing and using this water would be essential. Water is needed not just for drinking, but for growing food, producing breathable oxygen through electrolysis, manufacturing rocket fuel for potential return missions, and maintaining hygiene. The most promising sites for a Mars settlement are those where subsurface ice is accessible at shallow depths, meaning the settlers could mine the ice, melt it, and purify it for use. But extracting water from the Martian environment is not as simple as it might sound. The ice is mixed with soil, dust, and perchlorates, all of which would need to be removed before the water is safe to use. The extraction process would require energy, which on Mars means either solar power, which is limited and variable, or nuclear power, which requires bringing a reactor from Earth. The purification process would need to remove not just solid contaminants, but also the dissolved perchlorates that are so pervasive in the Martian environment, and water, once obtained, would need to be carefully managed. In a sealed habitat on Mars, every drop of water would be recycled. Wastewater from bathing, laundry, and toilet use would be processed and purified for reuse. Humidity from the air would be collected and reclaimed. Even the water that plants transpire in the greenhouse would be captured and recycled. This closed-loop water system would need to operate flawlessly for years, because any loss of water would be extremely difficult to replace. The International Space Station already uses a sophisticated water recycling system that converts urine and humidity into drinkable water with an efficiency of about 90%. A Mars settlement would need something similar, but more reliable and more efficient, because the consequences of a water system failure on Mars would be far more severe than on the station, where resupply is possible. Let us now discuss something that connects all of these individual challenges into a single, overarching reality. The concept of cumulative risk. Each of the hazards we have discussed, radiation, bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, immune suppression, psychological stress, toxic dust, and the harsh Martian environment, is dangerous on its own. But they do not occur in isolation. They occur simultaneously, interacting with each other in ways that can amplify their individual effects. For example, radiation damage to the immune system makes the body more vulnerable to infections, which are more likely in the confined environment of a spacecraft. Bone loss increases the risk of fractures, which would be more dangerous in a context where medical care is limited and the body's healing capacity is compromised by radiation and reduced gravity. Psychological stress impairs sleep, which reduces cognitive function, which increases the risk of errors, which could lead to accidents or equipment failures in an environment where every mistake has magnified consequences. This cascading effect of multiple simultaneous stresses is what makes a Mars mission so fundamentally different from anything we have attempted before. NASA uses the acronym RIDGE to describe the 5 major categories of spaceflight hazards: space radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth, gravity fields, and hostile or closed environments. Each letter represents a domain of risk that has been studied extensively in the context of shorter space missions. But the interaction between all 5 hazards over a 3-year period is largely unexplored territory. Computer models can simulate some of these interactions, but they are only as good as the data they are built on, and for many of the relevant variables, that data simply does not exist for mission durations of 3 years. The only way to truly understand the cumulative risk of a Mars mission is to conduct one, and that means accepting a level of uncertainty about the outcome that is fundamentally at odds with the way we normally approach human safety. This is the paradox at the heart of Mars exploration. We cannot know whether it is safe enough to go without going, and once we go, there may be no turning back. The astronauts who make that journey will be both explorers and test subjects, pioneers and guinea pigs, heroes and, if things go wrong, casualties of humanity's reach exceeding its grasp. Let's take some time now to talk about something rarely covered in depth, something that connects the physical experience of spaceflight to the deepest questions about human identity. Let us talk about what time itself feels like on a Mars mission, and how the perception of time could shape the psychological landscape of the journey. On Earth, time is measured by the rhythms of the natural world. Day follows night. Seasons change. Holidays arrive and pass. Birthdays are celebrated. Children grow. The passage of time is marked by events, both large and small, that give structure and meaning to our lives. We measure our years by the memories we create, the milestones we reach, and the changes we observe in ourselves and the people around us. On a Mars spacecraft, most of these markers disappear. There are no seasons. There are no holidays in any meaningful sense. There are no children growing, no friends visiting, no changes in the landscape outside the window, because the landscape is always the same infinite blackness. The days blur together. Monday feels the same as Saturday. January feels the same as July. The only reliable markers of time's passage are the mission clock on the wall and the slow, barely perceptible shift in the position of the stars. Psychologists who study time perception know that when events are rare and environments are monotonous, time seems to stretch. A week of sameness can feel like a month. A month can feel like a year. This subjective stretching of time is not just an illusion. It has real consequences for mental health and cognitive function. When time feels endless, motivation erodes. The goal, whether it is reaching Mars or returning to Earth, seems perpetually distant. The present moment feels both interminable and empty. There is a related phenomenon called temporal disorientation, where individuals in isolated and confined environments lose track of what day it is, what time it is, and how long they have been in confinement. This has been observed in submarine crews, Antarctic winter over teams, and participants in space simulation studies. In the Mars 500 experiment, researchers noted that crew members' activity levels declined significantly over the course of the mission, with some spending increasingly long periods sleeping or lying in their bunks, a pattern consistent with the withdrawal and disengagement that prolonged monotony can produce. For the Mars crew, maintaining a structured schedule with varied activities would be essential for preserving a sense of normalcy and purpose. But no schedule can fully replicate the richness and variety of life on Earth. And over 3 years, even the most carefully designed routine would begin to feel repetitive and hollow. This raises another question that is seldom discussed. What happens to a person's sense of self over 3 years of radical isolation? Our identities are not fixed, internal things. They are shaped and reinforced by our interactions with others, by the roles we play in our communities, by the feedback we receive from the people around us. A parent's identity as a parent is reinforced every day by the presence of their children. A doctor's identity as a healer is reinforced by the patients they treat. A friend's identity as a friend is reinforced by the conversations and shared experiences that sustain the relationship. On Mars, most of these identity-reinforcing connections would be severed or drastically attenuated. The crew members would still have each other, but a group of 4 to 6 people cannot provide the diversity of social input that a normal human life offers. Over time, the crew members' sense of who they are might begin to shift in profound and unpredictable ways. Let us return now to the body and examine one more system that would be profoundly affected by a Mars mission, one that connects the physical and psychological dimensions of spaceflight in ways that are only recently being understood. Let us talk about the vestibular system and the neurology of spatial orientation. Your ability to stand upright, walk in a straight line, and know which way is up depends on a remarkable sensory system located in your inner ear. The vestibular system consists of tiny fluid-filled canals and chambers lined with hair cells that detect the direction of gravity and the acceleration of your head. This information is integrated with input from your eyes and from sensors in your muscles and joints to create a coherent sense of your body's position and movement in space. In microgravity, the vestibular system receives contradictory signals. The fluid in the inner ear no longer settles in the way it does under gravity, so the hair cells send ambiguous information about which way is up. The eyes see one thing, the inner ear reports another, and the proprioceptive sensors in the muscles provide yet another conflicting data stream. The result, particularly in the first few days of spaceflight, is disorientation, nausea, and a condition known as space motion sickness that affects about 60 to 80% of astronauts. Most astronauts adapt to microgravity within a few days, as the brain learns to reinterpret the conflicting sensory signals. But this adaptation comes at a cost. The brain essentially recalibrates its spatial orientation system for a weightless environment, suppressing some inputs and amplifying others. When the astronaut returns to a gravitational environment, the recalibrated system must readapt, and this process can take days or weeks. During that readaptation period, balance is impaired, coordination is reduced, and the risk of falls and injuries is elevated. For a Mars crew, this readaptation challenge would occur at one of the most critical moments of the mission: arrival on the Martian surface. After 7 to 9 months of living in a world without up or down, they would suddenly need to function in a gravitational field, their vestibular systems recalibrated. For weightlessness, would need to readjust to Martian gravity. Their sense of balance would be unreliable, their coordination would be impaired, and they would need to perform physically demanding tasks while their brains struggled to figure out which way is down. Studies of astronauts returning from space station missions have shown that it can take days to weeks before balance and coordination return to normal. During that period, simple tasks like walking, turning corners, and climbing stairs become challenging. In some cases, astronauts have reported feeling as though the ground is tilting or moving beneath them, a disconcerting sensation that can persist for days after landing. On Mars, where every physical task would need to be performed in a spacesuit, and where a fall could damage critical equipment or the suit itself, impaired balance could be genuinely dangerous. And the vestibular challenges do not end after the initial adaptation to Mars gravity. When the crew eventually leaves Mars for the return trip, their vestibular systems would need to readapt to microgravity once more. And upon arriving back at Earth, they would face the most extreme readaptation of all, transitioning from microgravity to full Earth gravity, with vestibular systems that have spent 3 years bouncing between different gravitational environments. Neurologists who study spatial orientation have expressed concern that the repeated gravitational transitions of a Mars mission could cause lasting changes to the vestibular and sensorimotor systems. The brain might develop a kind of perpetual confusion about which gravitational environment it should be calibrated for, leading to persistent balance problems and spatial disorientation that could last for months or years after the mission ends. Let us also explore the implications of a Mars mission for human reproduction and development, because these questions, while often considered speculative or premature, are central to any serious discussion of permanent Mars settlement. If humans are going to live on Mars for generations rather than years, they will need to reproduce. And reproduction in the Martian environment introduces a host of unknowns that current science cannot answer with confidence. The effects of reduced gravity on mammalian reproduction are poorly understood. Some animal studies have shown that reproduction can occur in microgravity, but with complications. The gravitational threshold needed for normal embryonic development is unknown. Is Mars's 38% gravity enough? We simply do not know. Radiation adds another layer of concern. The gametes, eggs and sperm, are among the most radiation-sensitive cells in the human body. Prolonged exposure to the elevated radiation levels on Mars could damage the DNA in reproductive cells, increasing the risk of infertility, miscarriage, and birth defects. The developing fetus is extremely sensitive to radiation, particularly during the first trimester when organ systems are forming. The ethical dimensions of these unknowns are profound. Is it acceptable to conceive and bear children in an environment where the risks to their health are unknown and potentially severe? Would Mars-born children, raised in lower gravity and higher radiation, be able to live normal lives? Would they ever be able to visit Earth, the homeworld of their parents and ancestors? Or would they be trapped on Mars by a body that was built for a different world? These questions do not have easy answers, and they are likely to remain unanswered until humans actually attempt to live and reproduce on Mars. But they are questions that any serious Mars colonization effort must eventually confront, because a settlement that cannot sustain itself through natural reproduction is not truly self-sustaining. It is just a very expensive, very remote outpost that will eventually die when its last inhabitants grow old. Let us turn to one final physical consideration that ties many of our earlier threads together. Let us talk about the long-term effects of the Martian environment on the human eye. We have already discussed the fluid shifts that cause vision problems in microgravity, but the Martian environment poses additional challenges to eye health that deserve separate attention. The thin Martian atmosphere allows more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface than Earth's atmosphere does. While standard spacesuit visors and habitat windows would filter most UV radiation, any degradation of those protective systems over time could increase UV exposure for the settlers. A higher percentage of early onset cataracts has already been documented among astronauts who have flown in space, and the elevated radiation on Mars would only increase this risk further. More importantly, the pervasive dust on Mars poses a direct threat to eye health. The fine particles that make up Martian dust could irritate the eyes if they enter the habitat, and the combination of dust exposure, dry recycled air inside habitats, and the eye changes caused by earlier microgravity exposure could create a constellation of vision problems that would accumulate over time. Vision is arguably the most critical sense for survival on Mars. The ability to read instruments, navigate terrain, repair equipment, and identify hazards all depend on healthy eyesight. Any progressive loss of visual acuity in the Mars settlers would have serious implications for their ability to function and survive. And on a planet with no ophthalmologist and no access to advanced eye care, even relatively minor vision problems could become significant challenges over years and decades. Now let us bring all of these threads together and consider the full picture of what a Mars mission would mean for the humans who undertake it. The journey would begin with an act of extraordinary courage. A small group of men and women, selected from thousands of candidates, trained for years in every skill that might be needed, would climb into a spacecraft and leave the planet of their birth. They would watch through a small window as the Earth shrank behind them. First a disk, then a point, then nothing distinguishable from the stars. They would feel the last pull of Earth's gravity release its hold on their bodies, and they would float free in the cabin, weightless and vulnerable, beginning a journey of 7 to 9 months through the most hostile environment in our solar system. During those months, invisible particles of radiation would stream through their spacecraft, through their spacesuits, through their skin, and into their cells, silently damaging their DNA and altering their gene expression. Their bones would slowly dissolve, losing density at a rate of 1 to 1.5% per month. Their muscles would weaken, despite hours of daily exercise on equipment too small and too limited to fully replicate what their bodies need. Their hearts would begin to decondition, pumping less efficiently in a body that no longer needed to fight gravity. Their eyes would change shape as fluid accumulated in their skulls. Their immune systems would falter, leaving them more vulnerable to the microorganisms they carried in their own bodies. They would eat the same preserved meals day after day. They would breathe the same recycled air. They would see the same faces. They would hear the same sounds. And outside the walls of their small metal home, there would be nothing but the infinite, silent, pitiless emptiness of space. After 7 to 9 months, Mars would appear in their window, first as a bright orange point of light, then as a disk, then as a world, with craters and canyons and polar ice caps and the ruddy deserts of a planet that has been waiting for visitors for 4.5 billion years. The landing would be the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, a fiery descent through the thin Martian atmosphere followed by a powered landing on a surface that no human foot has ever touched. And when they stepped outside, they would find a world that is beautiful and terrible in equal measure. A landscape of rust-colored rock and dust stretching to a close horizon under a butterscotch sky. Temperatures far below zero. An atmosphere that would kill them in seconds without their suits. Soil laced with toxic chemicals. Radiation pouring down from a sky that offers no magnetic protection and little atmospheric shielding. This would be their new home. Not for weeks or months, but possibly for the rest of their lives. They would build their habitats. They would set up their life support systems. They would grow their food under artificial lights in pressurized greenhouses. They would mine ice from beneath the frozen ground and purify it for drinking water. They would repair equipment when it broke, improvise solutions to problems that no one on Earth had anticipated, and keep themselves alive through ingenuity, determination, and the sheer refusal to give up. They would look up at the Martian sky at night and see Earth as a point of light among the stars. They would know that on that tiny speck, 7 billion people were living their lives, falling in love, raising children, arguing about politics, watching movies, eating fresh fruit, breathing air that did not need to be manufactured, and they would know that they could not go back. That the world they came from was no longer accessible to them, not because of any barrier of law or policy, but because their bodies had been changed by the journey, because the return trip would compound that damage, and because the full weight of Earth's gravity might be more than their altered bones and weakened hearts could bear. The universe is vast beyond comprehension. It contains hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, many orbited by their own planets. The distances between these worlds are so great that light itself takes years, centuries, millennia to cross them. In this enormity, Earth is a mote, a tiny blue dot, as Carl Sagan famously described it, suspended in a sunbeam. And Mars, cold and barren and hostile as it is, sits just next door in cosmic terms. It is the closest world where humans might conceivably establish a lasting presence. It is the testing ground for every question we have about whether our species can transcend its origins and become something more than a single planet civilization. The people who go to Mars first will pay a price for that knowledge. Their bodies will be changed. Their minds will be tested. Their connection to Earth will be stretched to its breaking point and beyond. They may lose years from their lives. They may never see their families again. They may live out their days in a habitat on a frozen desert, breathing recycled air and eating food grown under artificial lights, watching Earth shrink to a point of light in a butterscotch sky. But they will also do something that no human being has ever done. They will stand on another world, not as visitors, but as inhabitants. They will look up at the stars and know that they are among them in a way that no earthbound person can truly understand. They will carry within them the seed of a future that extends beyond the lifespan of any individual, beyond the lifespan of nations and civilizations, beyond even the lifespan of Earth itself. Because one day, in the far future, the sun will die. If humanity is still confined to this one planet, that will be the end of us. But if we have spread to Mars, and from Mars to other worlds, then the death of the sun will be a chapter in our story, not the ending. That is why Mars matters, even though it is dangerous, even though it will change the people who go there in ways we are only beginning to understand. So what does it mean that anyone who goes to Mars will never come back. It means that the first Mars settlers will be making the greatest sacrifice in human history. It means they will be giving up everything familiar for everything unknown. It means they will be trading the certainty of Earth for the uncertainty of Mars, the comfort of home for the desolation of a new frontier. But it also means this: they will be opening a door that has been closed since the beginning of human existence. They will be taking the first step on a journey that has no end, a journey that stretches from this small blue planet to every world that circles every star in every galaxy in this vast and ancient universe. They will be the first to cross a threshold that, once crossed, changes everything. And in the end, that might be worth the price. Not for the individuals who pay it, because the cost to them will be immense and irreversible, but for the species they represent, for the children who will follow them, for the civilizations that will rise on the worlds we have not yet discovered, for the consciousness that burns in every human mind and yearns, always, to know what lies beyond the next horizon. Mars is waiting, cold and silent and patient. It sits in the darkness of space. It offers no warmth, no comfort, no easy answers. But it offers something that no other place in the solar system can offer right now. It offers a future, a hard one, a dangerous one, a one-way future for those brave enough to reach for it. And as you lie here, as your eyes grow heavy and the words of this story begin to fade into the gentle hum of sleep, think about what it means that despite everything, despite the radiation and the bone loss and the toxic dust and the infinite silence of space, there are people who will look at Mars and say, "Yes, I will go." That, more than anything else, is what makes us human. The cosmos does not care about us. The stars do not notice our presence, but we notice the universe. We look up at the night sky and feel wonder. We send robots to Mars and weep when they send back photographs of sunsets on another world. And maybe the desire to explore is the closest thing we have to a universal human impulse, the faith that there is always more to discover, always another frontier, waiting just beyond the edge of what we thought was possible. Mars is that frontier now, cold, dangerous, unforgiving, and impossibly far away. But it is there, and we are here, and the distance between us is closing, slowly but surely, as our rockets get bigger and our understanding of the challenges grows deeper. One day someone will make the journey. They will leave Earth, and they will not come back. They will be the bravest or the most visionary people our species has ever produced. And whatever happens to them, they will have done something that changes the trajectory of human history forever. They will have made us a species that lives on more than one world. Let us take some time now to talk about something rarely covered in depth, something that connects the physical experience of spaceflight to the deepest questions about human identity. Let us talk about what time itself feels like on a Mars mission, and how the perception of time could shape the psychological landscape of the journey. On Earth, time is measured by the rhythms of the natural world. Day follows night, seasons change, holidays arrive and pass, birthdays are celebrated, children grow. The passage of time is marked by events, both large and small, that give structure and meaning to our lives. We measure our years by the memories we create, the milestones we reach, and the changes we observe in ourselves and the people around us. On a Mars spacecraft, most of these markers disappear. There are no seasons. There are no holidays in any meaningful sense. There are no children growing, no friends visiting, no changes in the landscape outside the window, because the landscape is always the same infinite blackness. The days blur together. Monday feels the same as Saturday. January feels the same as July. The only reliable markers of time's passage are the mission clock on the wall and the slow, barely perceptible shift in the position of the stars. Psychologists who study time perception know that when events are rare and environments are monotonous, time seems to stretch. A week of sameness can feel like a month. A month can feel like a year. This subjective stretching of time is not just an illusion. It has real consequences for mental health and cognitive function. When time feels endless, motivation erodes. The goal, whether it is reaching Mars or returning to Earth, seems perpetually distant. The present moment feels both interminable and empty. There is a related phenomenon called temporal disorientation, where individuals in isolated and confined environments lose track of what day it is, what time it is, and how long they have been in confinement. This has been observed in submarine crews, polar researchers, and participants in space simulation studies. For a Mars crew, temporal disorientation could affect everything from mission scheduling to medication timing, to the psychological sense of progress toward a goal. The Mars 500 study provided some insight into how time perception shifts during a simulated Mars mission. Researchers observed that crew members' activity levels and sleep patterns changed significantly over the 520-day simulation, with some individuals becoming increasingly sedentary and sleeping for longer periods as the mission progressed. This was interpreted as a form of psychological hibernation, a withdrawal from the monotonous environment into the refuge of sleep. Whether this same pattern would emerge on a real Mars mission is unknown, but it suggests that the experience of endlessly stretching time could drive crew members toward disengagement rather than active participation in mission activities. One proposed countermeasure for temporal disorientation is the creation of artificial events and milestones throughout the mission. These might include celebrations of mission landmarks, rotating responsibilities and activities, scheduled recreational events, and even surprise deliveries of special meals or entertainment from mission planners on Earth. Some researchers have suggested that the crew should be encouraged to maintain personal projects, journals, or creative endeavors that provide a sense of individual progress and accomplishment independent of mission objectives. But all of these interventions are, at best, partial solutions to a fundamental problem. The human mind was not designed for years of confinement in an unchanging environment, and no amount of clever scheduling can fully compensate for the absence of the natural variety and stimulation that Earth provides. Now let us discuss something that ties together many of the threads we have been weaving throughout this exploration. Let us talk about what happens when things go wrong on Mars, because the question of emergency response on a planet 225 million miles from the nearest hospital is one of the most sobering aspects of any Mars mission proposal. On the International Space Station, emergencies are managed through a combination of onboard training and real-time communication with mission control. If a fire breaks out, mission control can provide immediate guidance. If an astronaut has a medical emergency, flight surgeons on the ground can diagnose and recommend treatment within seconds. If a critical system fails, engineers on Earth can analyze the problem and develop solutions that the crew can implement within minutes or hours. And if all else fails, the crew can evacuate to a Soyuz or Crew Dragon capsule and return to Earth within hours. None of this is possible on Mars. Communication delays of up to 22 minutes one way mean that any conversation with mission control takes at minimum 44 minutes for a single exchange. During a fire, a medical emergency, or a habitat breach, 44 minutes is an eternity. the crew would need to handle the emergency entirely on their own, relying on their training, their judgment, and whatever equipment and supplies are available. This requirement for complete autonomy in emergencies represents a paradigm shift in how human space missions are conducted. For 60 years, from Mercury through Gemini, Apollo, the Space Shuttle, and the International Space Station, human spaceflight has relied on the constant support of a ground team. Mission control has been the safety net, the backup brain, the source of expertise and reassurance that keeps astronauts alive when things go sideways. Taking that safety net away is not just a logistical change. It is a psychological one. The knowledge that you are truly on your own, that no one on Earth can help you in real time, that every decision you make in a crisis is your decision and yours alone, adds a layer of psychological burden that is qualitatively different from anything astronauts have experienced before. Consider a scenario that spaceflight medicine experts have studied extensively. An astronaut on Mars develops acute appendicitis. On Earth, this would require a straightforward surgical procedure, routinely performed in any hospital. On Mars, the crew would need to perform the surgery themselves, in a habitat that is not designed as an operating room, using medical supplies that may have been stored for years, under conditions of reduced gravity that would affect both the surgical technique and the patient's physiology. The surgeon would likely be a crew member with some medical training, but not a full surgical residency. There would be no anesthesiologist, no sterile operating suite, no post-operative intensive care unit. If the surgery goes well, the patient recovers. If it does not, if there are complications, if an infection develops in an environment where immune systems are already compromised and antibiotic supplies are limited, the consequences could be fatal. And there would be nothing anyone on Earth could do about it except listen to the delayed transmissions and offer advice that arrives too late to change the outcome. This is not a hypothetical concern. Appendicitis affects approximately 7% of the general population over a lifetime. For a crew of 6 to 8 people on a 3-year mission, the probability that at least one crew member will develop appendicitis or a similarly serious acute medical condition is not negligible. And appendicitis is just one of hundreds of medical emergencies that could occur. Heart attacks, strokes, severe injuries from falls or equipment accidents, allergic reactions, dental emergencies, kidney stones, and psychological crises are all possibilities that mission planners must account for. Some proposals for Mars missions have suggested that crew members should have their appendixes removed before departure as a preventive measure. Others have proposed that each crew member should receive extensive medical and surgical training, far beyond what current astronauts receive. Still others have suggested that advanced telemedicine systems, potentially enhanced by artificial intelligence, could help bridge the gap between the crew's medical capabilities and the expertise that would be available on Earth, despite the communication delay. All of these ideas have merit, but none of them fully solve the problem. You cannot preventively remove every organ that might cause trouble. You cannot train someone to be a surgeon, a cardiologist, a psychiatrist, and an emergency medicine specialist all at once. And you cannot overcome the fundamental limitation of communication delay, which means that for the most critical minutes of any emergency, the crew is entirely on their own. Let us talk about one more dimension of the Mars experience that is deeply human and rarely discussed in the technical literature. Let us talk about grief. On a 3-year Mars mission, there is a very real probability that someone the crew members love will die while they are away. Parents, grandparents, siblings, friends, former colleagues, any of them could pass away during the 3 years that the crew is gone. On Earth, when someone we love dies, we gather with family and friends. We attend funerals. We hold each other. We share memories. We mourn together. These rituals of grief are not just cultural conventions. They are psychologically essential processes that help us process loss and begin to heal. On Mars, none of this would be possible. A crew member who learns that a parent has died would receive the news via a delayed message, a recorded video or text that arrives minutes after it was sent, from a world that is hundreds of millions of miles away. They could not fly home for the funeral. They could not hold their remaining family members. They could not visit the grave. They would be alone with their grief, in a small habitat on a dead planet, surrounded by crewmates who may or may not understand the depth of their loss. The psychological impact of grieving in isolation, without the support structures that human beings rely on, is a genuine concern for long-duration space missions. Grief can trigger depression, anxiety, withdrawal, and cognitive impairment, all of which could compromise the crew member's ability to perform mission-critical tasks. And because the crew is small and every member is essential, the loss of one person's effectiveness affects the entire team. There is also the reverse scenario. What if a crew member dies during the mission? What if someone is killed in an accident, succumbs to a medical emergency, or takes their own life? The remaining crew would need to cope with the loss of a colleague and friend while continuing to operate in a hostile environment with no possibility of replacement personnel. They would need to handle the remains in a setting where there is no morgue, no funeral home, and no culturally appropriate way to honor the dead. They would need to redistribute the deceased crew members' responsibilities among the survivors, and they would need to do all of this while processing their own grief, fear, and the inescapable awareness that they could be next. These are not comfortable topics. They are not the subjects of inspiring space exploration, documentaries, or upbeat mission previews. But they are realities that any honest assessment of a Mars mission must confront. Death and grief are part of the human experience, and they do not pause for the convenience of a mission timeline. Now, as we begin to draw this exploration toward its close, let us step back and consider the full picture of what a Mars mission represents. Not just the science, not just the risks, not just the challenges, but the totality of what it means for a human being to leave one world and go to another. A Mars astronaut would experience something that no human being in history has ever experienced. They would watch Earth shrink until it disappears. They would float in silence between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. They would set foot on ground that has never been touched by a living thing. They would breathe air manufactured by machines, drink water filtered from ice that has been frozen for millions of years, and eat food grown under lights powered by a distant sun. They would feel the weight of Mars under their boots, lighter than Earth but heavier than the weightlessness of the transit. They would explore canyons that dwarf the Grand Canyon, volcanoes that tower above Mount Everest, and plains that stretch unbroken to a horizon that curves more sharply than any they have known. They would witness Martian sunsets where the sky turns blue at the edges, while the sun appears as a small, cold disk sinking behind a landscape of rust and silence. They would also feel the weight of absence, the absence of trees and grass and the smell of rain, the absence of birdsong in the morning and cricket song at night, the absence of the face of someone they love, seen in person rather than on a screen with a 20-minute delay, the absence of the feeling of coming home, of turning a key in a familiar door, of sitting in a favorite chair and knowing that this is where you belong. For the first Mars settlers, every gain would come with a corresponding loss. Every discovery would be accompanied by a reminder of what was left behind. Every moment of wonder at the alien beauty of Mars would be shadowed by a pang of longing for the natural beauty of Earth. This is the emotional algebra of interplanetary exploration, and it is a calculation that each individual will need to balance in their own way. Some will find the balance tips toward wonder. They will be so consumed by the magnitude of what they are doing, by the privilege of being the first humans on another world, that the losses fade into the background. They will find purpose and meaning in the work, in the exploration, in the knowledge that they are writing a new chapter in the story of life itself. Others may find the balance tips toward grief. They will feel the losses more acutely than the gains. They will lie awake in their bunks on Mars, staring at the ceiling of a habitat that is not home, missing the sound of wind through leaves, the warmth of a summer afternoon, the voice of someone they love speaking to them without a 20-minute delay. They will carry the weight of their sacrifice not as a badge of honor, but as a burden that grows heavier with each passing soul. And most probably will oscillate between the two. Some days will be days of wonder and purpose. Other days will be days of loneliness and doubt. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, but so is the human capacity for nostalgia, for homesickness, for the ache of separation from everything that once defined us. What we do know is this: the people who go to Mars will be changed by the experience in ways that are as profound as they are unpredictable. They will carry Mars inside them for the rest of their lives, just as the Apollo astronauts carried the moon inside them. But unlike the Apollo astronauts, who returned to Earth after a few days, the Mars settlers may never have the chance to set their memories against the reality of the world they left behind. Their memories of Earth will be all they have, and over time, those memories will soften and blur, the way all memories do, until the world they remember is not quite the world that exists. They will have made us a species that lives on more than one world, and that, in the quiet darkness of a Martian night, under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, will be enough. It will have to be. There is one final thought worth sharing before we close this journey together. It is about the nature of courage. We often think of courage as the absence of fear, but that is not what real courage looks like. Real courage is knowing exactly how dangerous something is and choosing to do it anyway. Real courage is understanding the full weight of what you are giving up and walking through the door regardless. The first Mars astronauts will not be reckless. They will know, with the precision of scientists and the clarity of informed adults, exactly what the radiation will do to their DNA, what the microgravity will do to their bones, what the isolation will do to their minds, and what the distance will do to their hearts. They will know that their chances of returning to Earth in the same condition they left are essentially zero, and they will go anyway. Because the human story is not a story about comfort or safety. It is a story about reaching. Every generation in human history has produced individuals who looked at the horizon and said, "I wonder what is on the other side." The first people to cross the Pacific in wooden canoes did not know what lay ahead. The first people to climb the Himalayas did not know if they would survive, and in every case, the world was made larger by their willingness to accept the risk. Mars is the next horizon, the biggest one our species has ever faced, and the people who cross it will not come back unchanged. They may not come back at all, but the door they open will never close. The path they forge will be walked by others until what was once impossible becomes routine. That is how human progress works. It starts with someone willing to pay the price. So yes, anyone who goes to Mars will probably never come back. Not as the person they were when they left. The journey will change them in every way a person can be changed, from the molecules in their bones to the memories in their minds. But they will not be lost. They will be found on the surface of a new world, under a butterscotch sky, in the history books of a civilization that refused to stay small, and in the hearts of every child who looks up at the night sky and thinks, someone is there. Someone was brave enough. That wraps up today's journey through one of the most profound challenges humanity will ever face. The road to Mars is long, dangerous, and very likely a one-way trip for those who dare to walk it. But it is also a road that leads to the future. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Cosmic Drift. Leave a comment below and tell us, would you go to Mars, knowing you might never come back? We would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next one. Until then, keep looking up.